Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Frozen Choir of Pinecrest. In the winter of 1987, the small town of Pinecrest, Manitoba became the center of something that still haunts the surviving residents to this day. Pinecrest was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest event of the year was the annual Christmas Eve choir performance at St. Michael's Church. Darren Whitlock had just moved to Pinecrest with his wife, Sandra, and their 8-year-old daughter, Emily. Darren had taken a job as the new music teacher at the local elementary school, and Sandra worked as a nurse at the town's only medical clinic. They'd bought the old Brennan house on Maple Street, a charming 2-story home that had been empty for 3 years after the previous owner passed away. The townspeople welcomed them with open arms. Within weeks, Darren was invited to direct the church choir for the Christmas Eve service. He was thrilled. The choir consisted of 12 members, all locals who'd been singing together for years. There was Margaret Thorne, the 72-year-old soprano who'd never missed a service in 50 years. Bernard Kosinski, the baritone who owned the hardware store. Lillian Duchamp, the alto who taught French at the high school. And 9 others, each with their own story, their own life woven into the fabric of Pinecrest. Rehearsals began in early November. The church was a beautiful old building, constructed in 1903, with high vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the wooden pews. But there was something about the building that made Darren uneasy. The basement, in particular, gave him chills. It was where they stored old hymnals and Christmas decorations, and where the furnace rumbled and clanked throughout the night. During one rehearsal, Margaret pulled Darren aside. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She told him about the dreams. Every member of the choir had been having the same dream for the past 2 weeks. In the dream, they were singing in the church, but the building was filled with ice. Their breath came out in frozen clouds, and their voices seemed to echo forever, never fading. In each dream, they looked down to see their feet frozen to the floor, ice creeping up their legs, and a figure standing in the shadows at the back of the church, watching them with empty eyes. Darren laughed it off as pre-performance jitters, but he couldn't shake his own unease. Sandra noticed he'd been coming home later and later from rehearsals, and when she asked why, he told her he kept hearing things after everyone left. Footsteps in the empty church, the sound of singing coming from the basement. Once, he swore he heard his own voice echoing back to him, singing words he hadn't spoken. The week before Christmas, Bernard Kosinski didn't show up to rehearsal. His wife called the church, frantic. He'd left for rehearsal but never arrived. The police found his truck parked outside the church, keys still in the ignition, but Bernard was nowhere to be found. Inside the church, they discovered something that made even the veteran officer's blood run cold. In the basement, next to the furnace, someone had carved words into the concrete floor. The frozen choir sings forever. They found Bernard 3 days later. He was in the church's bell tower, a place that had been locked for decades due to structural concerns. He was frozen solid, despite the fact that the temperature inside the tower was well above freezing. His mouth was open, caught mid-song, and his eyes were glazed with frost. The coroner couldn't explain it. The autopsy revealed that Bernard had somehow frozen from the inside out. The choir wanted to cancel the Christmas Eve service, but Father Macmillan insisted they continue. It would honor Bernard's memory, he said. Darren reluctantly agreed, though every instinct told him to refuse. On Christmas Eve, the church was packed. Nearly 300 people filled the pews, including Sandra and Emily, who sat in the 3rd row. The service began normally. Candles were lit, prayers were said, and then it was time for the choir to sing. As they stood and began their first hymn, Darren felt the temperature drop. He could see his breath. So could everyone in the congregation. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the church into darkness except for the candlelight. What happened next was witnessed by everyone present, and their testimonies have never wavered, despite years of scrutiny and disbelief. The choir continued singing, but their voices changed. They became deeper, layered, as if 100 voices were singing through each person. The stained glass windows began to frost over from the inside. Ice spread across the walls, across the pews, across the floor. Margaret Thorne screamed. They all looked down to see ice crawling up from the floor, encasing their feet, their legs. Darren tried to move but found himself frozen in place. The congregation panicked, people trampling over each other to reach the doors. But the doors wouldn't open. Sandra grabbed Emily and held her close, both of them watching in horror as the choir members became living ice sculptures, still singing, their voices growing more distorted with each passing second. Then, from the shadows at the back of the church, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, with skin that looked like cracked ice, and eyes that were nothing but hollow voids. In a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves, it spoke. The song must never end. The frozen choir sings forever. Father Macmillan tried to perform an exorcism, shouting prayers over the chaos, but his voice was drowned out by the choir's inhuman singing. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The lights came back on. The ice vanished. The choir stood there, silent and confused, with no memory of what had just happened. But 11 people were missing from the congregation. 11 people, including Sandra and Emily Whitlock, were never seen again. Their bodies were never found. And to this day, on cold winter nights, people in Pinecrest report hearing singing coming from St. Michael's Church, even though the building was demolished in 1988. The sound of a choir, beautiful and terrible, singing songs that no human throat should be able to produce. Darren Whitlock left town the day after Christmas and was found dead in a motel room in Thunder Bay 2 months later. The coroner ruled it suicide, but those who saw the body said his skin was covered in frost and his eyes were frozen open, staring at something only he could see. Story 2. The substitute of Clearwater. Clearwater, Alberta was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. A population of 800 people, one main street, a school that taught kindergarten through 12th grade, all in the same building. In the fall of 1993, something arrived in Clearwater that would change everything. Melissa Carver was a bright, popular 10th grader, captain of the volleyball team, and destined for a scholarship to a good university. Her best friend was Tricia Langford, and together they were inseparable. They had their whole lives planned out. They'd go to university together, travel Europe, maybe start a business. Nothing was going to stop them. When their English teacher, Mr. Holbrook, suffered a sudden heart attack in October, the school board scrambled to find a replacement. What they got was Nolan Everett, a thin man in his 40s with pale skin, dark hair slicked back, and eyes that seemed just a shade too light to be natural. He arrived on a Monday morning with no references anyone could verify, but the school was desperate, and he had all the right paperwork. From the first day, something felt wrong. Nolan Everett didn't teach like other teachers. He didn't follow the curriculum. Instead, he spent his classes telling stories. Dark, twisted stories about people who lost themselves, who became something other than human. Stories about towns where everyone disappeared overnight, about children who stopped being children, about the spaces between what we see and what's really there. At first, the students were entertained. It beat reading Shakespeare. But then things started changing. Students who paid attention in Mr. Everett's class began acting strangely. Jacob Hartley, the quarterback of the football team, started coming to school with dark circles under his eyes, mumbling about the spaces in his house where reality felt thin. Christine Pemberton, straight-A student and class president, stopped talking entirely for 3 days, and when she finally spoke again, she told the school counselor that she could hear Mr. Everett's voice in her head, teaching her things she didn't want to know. Melissa noticed that Tricia was becoming obsessed with Mr. Everett's classes. She'd started writing down everything he said, filling notebook after notebook with his words. When Melissa asked her about it, Tricia said something that made her blood run cold. "He's teaching us the truth, Mel. He's showing us what we really are." Parents started complaining. Several demanded that Everett be fired, but Principal Yardley refused. He said Everett was the best teacher the school had ever had, that test scores were improving, that the students were more engaged than ever. But those who looked closely at Principal Yardley noticed that his eyes had taken on that same too-light quality as Everett's. Things escalated when students started disappearing during school hours. Not permanently, but for hours at a time. They'd be marked present in the morning, then vanish, only to reappear at the end of the day with no memory of where they'd been. Security footage showed them walking into Mr. Everett's classroom during lunch or study hall, but never coming out. Melissa decided to investigate. She skipped her math class and crept down to Everett's empty classroom. The door was locked, but she could hear something inside. Voices. Dozens of voices, all speaking in unison, reciting something in a language she didn't recognize. She pressed her ear to the door and felt it vibrate with the sound. When the door suddenly opened, she fell into the room and found herself staring up at Nolan Everett. But he didn't look angry. He looked pleased. "Melissa Carver," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the empty classroom. "I was wondering when you'd come." The classroom wasn't empty. 20 students sat at their desks, including Tricia, all staring straight ahead with those two light eyes. They were pale, their skin almost translucent, and they were whispering in that same unknown language. Everett helped Melissa to her feet. "Your friend has been learning," he said. "They all have. I'm teaching them to shed their skin, to become what they were always meant to be. Human is such a limiting form, don't you think?" Melissa tried to run, but the students stood as one, blocking her path. Everett placed a hand on her shoulder, and she felt something cold seep into her skin, into her bones. "You have a choice," he whispered. "Learn and transcend, or resist, and watch everyone you love transform without you." She broke free and ran, bursting out of the classroom and into the hallway. She ran straight to the principal's office, but Principal Yardley just smiled at her with those pale eyes and asked why she wasn't in class. The secretary, Mrs. Donnelly, stood up from her desk, and Melissa saw that her skin was starting to become translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. Melissa ran home and told her parents everything. Her father, Thomas Carver, was a former police officer. He believed her. He drove to the school with his hunting rifle, determined to confront Everett, but when they arrived, the school was empty. Every classroom vacant, every hallway silent. The only thing they found was a note on Everett's desk, written in perfect cursive. "The lesson continues elsewhere." Over the next week, students started returning to their homes, but they were different. They moved in sync, spoke in the same cadence, and their eyes had all taken on that pale, unnatural quality. Parents tried to take them to doctors, but the children refused to go. When Thomas tried to force his daughter's friend, Tricia, into his truck to drive her to the hospital in Edmonton, all 20 of the affected students appeared at his house within minutes, standing in his yard, staring at him with those terrible eyes. The RCMP were called. Officers came from 3 surrounding districts, but when they tried to question the students, the officers themselves began to change. Within hours, their eyes paled, their skin grew translucent, and they joined the students in their silent vigil around town. Melissa's family fled Clearwater that night, along with 15 other families. The rest stayed, either because they couldn't leave or because they'd already been changed. The last anyone heard from Clearwater was a week later, when a truck driver passing through reported that everyone in town was standing in the main street, all facing the school, all perfectly still. When authorities arrived the next day, the town was empty. 800 people, gone. The school remained, and in every classroom, words were written on the blackboards in that same perfect cursive. Lesson complete. Class dismissed. Clearwater remains abandoned to this day. The government claimed it was due to contaminated groundwater, but no official records exist of any such contamination. Melissa Carver, now going by a different name, still has nightmares about those pale eyes. And sometimes, when she looks in the mirror, she swears she can see her own eyes starting to lighten. Just a shade. The lesson, it seems, is never truly over. Story 3. The Beckoner of Thornhill Bay. Thornhill Bay, Nova Scotia, was a fishing village of 400 souls, perched on the edge of the Atlantic, where the wind never stopped howling, and the waves crashed against ancient rocks with relentless fury. In the summer of 1999, something came out of the ocean that the locals would spend decades trying to forget. Felix Doucette was a third-generation fisherman, a man who knew the sea better than he knew his own face. He'd survived 3 hurricanes, countless storms, and waters that had claimed lesser men. His crew consisted of his younger brother, Raymond, and 2 locals, Gavin Sheffield and Marcus LeBlanc. They ran a small operation, hauling lobster traps and cod, making enough to support their families, and not much more. On July 15th, they went out at dawn as usual. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so. Felix remarked that in 30 years of fishing, he'd never seen the water so still, like glass stretching to the horizon. They reached their usual spots and began hauling traps, but every single one came up empty. Not just empty of catch, but empty of bait, too. The bait was simply gone, as if something had carefully removed it without springing the traps. As they moved to deeper waters, Raymond spotted something floating in the distance. At first they thought it was a buoy, but as they approached, they realized it was a person. A woman, floating face down, wearing what looked like a white dress. Felix maneuvered the boat closer, and Gavin used a gaff to pull her alongside. When they turned her over, they all recoiled. It wasn't a woman. It was something that looked like a woman, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, the fingers had too many joints, and the face, while beautiful, had features that didn't quite align properly. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth too wide. And it was breathing. Despite being face down in the ocean for God knows how long, it was breathing. Its eyes opened. They were completely black. No whites, no iris, just endless black that seemed to pull at something deep inside each man who looked at them. Then it smiled, and they saw that it had too many teeth, arranged in rows like a shark. It spoke in a voice that sounded like waves crashing, like wind whistling through caves. "You found me," it said. "Now I can beckon." Before anyone could react, it grabbed Raymond by the wrist and pulled him overboard. Felix lunged for his brother but only caught air. Raymond was screaming, being dragged beneath the surface by the thing that wasn't a woman. Felix dove in after him, his crew shouting, and in the murky water, he saw his brother sinking. That creature wrapped around him, pulling him down into darkness. Felix surfaced, gasping, but Raymond was gone. The creature was gone. The sea was still as glass. They searched for 3 hours before Felix finally agreed to return to shore and alert the Coast Guard. The search turned up nothing. No body, no trace of Raymond. But that night, Felix stood on his dock and saw something that made him question his sanity. Raymond was standing on the water. Not swimming, not drowning, but standing, as if the ocean was solid ground beneath his feet. He was maybe 50 feet from shore, just standing there, staring at Felix with eyes that had gone completely black. Then Raymond raised his hand and gestured for Felix to come. That beckoning motion, simple and familiar, a gesture Raymond had used 1,000 times to call Felix over for a beer or to look at something interesting. But there was something wrong about it now, something predatory. Felix started walking toward the water before he realized what he was doing. His feet were at the edge of the dock, and he was about to step off when his wife, Colette, grabbed him from behind, screaming his name. The spell broke. He looked back at the water, and Raymond was gone. Over the next week, 5 more people disappeared from Thornhill Bay. All fishermen, all men who worked the sea. And each night, the missing appeared, standing on the water, beckoning to their loved ones. Gavin's wife nearly drowned trying to reach him. Marcus's father had to be physically restrained from walking into the ocean. Father Gagnon, the local priest, attempted an exorcism of the bay itself, standing on the dock and shouting prayers into the wind. He was found the next morning, standing on the water himself, beckoning to his parishioners who'd come to morning mass. The town held an emergency meeting. 30 families packed into the community center, terrified and desperate for answers. It was old Margaret Whelan, 93 years old, and the oldest person in Thornhill Bay, who told them the truth. Her grandmother had told her stories about the beckoners, creatures from deep in the Atlantic Trench, older than humanity, who came to shore every few centuries to feed. They didn't eat flesh. They ate something else, something Margaret's grandmother called the shore tie, the connection between a person and the land. Once beckoned, a person was never truly on land again. Part of them always remained in the water, always pulling, always calling them back. And when they finally answered that call, they became beckoners themselves, transformed into something between human and whatever lived in those impossible depths. The only way to break the beckoning, Margaret said, was to reject it completely. To never look at the ones who called, to never listen, to leave the coast entirely and never return. The shore tie had to be severed voluntarily, or the beckoning would eventually win. 50 families left Thornhill Bay in the following month. They sold their homes for nothing, abandoned their boats, their traps, their entire lives. Felix tried to stay. He couldn't leave his brother, couldn't leave the sea that had been his family's livelihood for 3 generations. But every night, Raymond stood on the water, beckoning. And every night, it became harder to resist. The night Felix finally broke, Colette found him waist-deep in the ocean at 2 a.m, walking toward where Raymond stood. She and Gavin dragged him back, threw him in their truck, and drove. They didn't stop until they reached Ontario, as far from the ocean as they could get. Thornhill Bay still exists, but fewer than 50 people remain. The fishing industry collapsed. Boats rot at their moorings, and on clear nights you can see them. Dozens of figures standing on the water, beckoning, beckoning, always beckoning. The RCMP officially classify the disappearances as drownings, but those who know the truth understand that drowning would be merciful. The beckoned don't drown. They transform. They become part of something ancient and hungry, something that waits in the deep places where light never reaches. And they beckon others to join them, to abandon the shore, and embrace the crushing, endless dark. Felix Doucette died in 2018 in a landlocked town 1,000 miles from the sea. But his family says that in his final moments, he sat up in bed, stared at the wall, smiled, and reached out his hand in that familiar beckoning gesture. Then he was gone. Story 4. The inheritors of Ashmont, Saskatchewan was dying. Like many prairie towns, it had been hemorrhaging population for decades. In 1962, it had been home to 2,000 people. By 2004, that number had dwindled to 312, most of them elderly, clinging to farms that barely turned a profit and a way of life that was slowly disappearing. Then the Ashworth family arrived, and everything changed. Nobody knew where the Ashworths came from exactly. They simply appeared one September morning, a convoy of 5 cars pulling into town. And by the end of the week, they'd purchased the old Mackenzie estate, 3,000 acres of prime farmland, and the abandoned grain elevator on the edge of town. There were 13 of them. 3 generations, from grandmother Constance Ashworth, a severe woman in her 70s, down to the youngest 6-year-old Iris Preston Kellaway, who served as Ashmont's mayor, town clerk, and only lawyer, was thrilled. New blood, new money, a family willing to invest in the community. Within a month, the Ashworths had renovated the grain elevator into some kind of processing facility, had hired 20 locals to work their farms, and had donated $50,000 to renovate the town's community center. But there was something off about the Ashworths. They were polite, generous, and seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of the community. But they never quite looked at you directly. Their smiles were always a half-second too late. And they moved with a synchronization that was unnerving, like they were all listening to the same internal rhythm. Donna Kellaway, Preston's wife, was one of the first to notice the changes in the people who worked for the Ashworths. Harold Gaines, who'd been hired as a farmhand, had always been a jovial man, quick with a joke and a smile. After 2 weeks working for the Ashworths, he'd become quiet, reserved. He showed up to church on Sunday, which was unusual because Harold had never been particularly religious, and sat in the back pew, staring straight ahead, barely blinking. More people started working for the Ashworths. They paid well, far better than anyone else in town could afford. And in a dying community, people couldn't refuse. Within 3 months, 60 people were employed by the Ashworth operation. And all of them started changing. They became quiet, synchronized. They stopped going to the bar, stopped gossiping, stopped all the small social interactions that made a small town function. The breaking point came during the annual Harvest Festival in October. The Ashworths donated the entire event, paid for everything, even hired a band from Regina. But the festival felt wrong. Everyone who worked for the Ashworths attended, standing in groups, watching everyone else with those not-quite-right gazes. And when the band started playing, the Ashworth employees began to dance. But it wasn't dancing. It was movement, perfectly synchronized, every person making the exact same motions at the exact same time. 60 people moving as one, and as they moved, they hummed. A low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in everyone's chest. Several children started crying. Dogs began howling. And in the center of the dancing crowd stood Constance Ashworth, conducting them like an orchestra with subtle movements of her hands. Donna grabbed Preston and told him they needed to leave. He agreed. But as they walked to their truck, they found their path blocked by Harold Gaines and 6 other Ashworth employees. Harold smiled that too-late smile and said, "The family would like to speak with you about inheriting." What happened in that meeting was never fully disclosed, but Preston and Donna left town that night with their 2 teenage sons. They never came back, never sold their property, never returned phone calls. Other families began leaving too, not all at once, but steadily. The message was clear: work for the Ashworths and change or leave. By Christmas, the population of Ashmont had dropped to 150. By the following summer, only 83 people remained. All of them worked for the Ashworths. All of them had that same synchronized quality, that same humming sound when they gathered. A reporter from the Regina Leader Post, Bradley Chong, decided to investigate. Hess drove to Ashmont in August of 2005, determined to write a story about the mysterious family that had taken over an entire town. He checked into the town's only motel and began asking questions. The locals were polite but unhelpful. They spoke in the same flat tone, gave the same vague answers. Everything was fine. The Ashworths were wonderful. The town was thriving. But Bradley noticed things. The way everyone moved at the same pace. The way conversations would pause when someone who didn't work for the Ashworths approached. The complete absence of children playing or dogs barking or any of the normal sounds of life. He managed to get an interview with Constance Ashworth herself. She received him in the renovated grain elevator, which had been transformed into something between an office building and a cathedral. High ceilings, strange geometric patterns painted on the walls, and a low humming sound that Bradley couldn't locate the source of. Constance explained that the Ashworths were inheritors, tasked with preserving and propagating a specific way of being. They'd done this in 17 towns across North America over the past century. They arrived, they integrated, they converted. Converting didn't mean religion, she explained. It meant something deeper, a complete restructuring of how a person thought, how they connected to others, how they perceived reality itself. We inherit the dying places, Constance said, and we give them new purpose. Everyone here is part of something larger now. They're connected, they're preserved. When this body wears out, the pattern transfers to another. Consciousness becomes a shared resource. Individuality is maintained, but it's also transcended. Bradley asked if people had a choice. Constance smiled. They chose to stay. That's choice enough. Bradley left the interview feeling sick. He tried calling the RCMP, but his phone had no signal. He tried his laptop, but the motel's internet was down. When he went to his truck, he found all 4 tires slashed. And standing in the motel parking lot were 20 Ashworth employees, including Harold Gaines, all staring at him with that synchronized gaze. He ran. For 3 days, he hid in the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town, surviving on gas station food he'd bought before the interview. On the 3rd night, he managed to steal a working vehicle and escaped, driving straight through to Regina, not stopping until he was in the RCMP station, demanding they investigate. They did. A team of 6 officers drove to Ashmont and found a thriving community. Everyone was polite, cooperative, and insisted everything was wonderful. The officers found no evidence of criminal activity, no signs of coercion, nothing illegal whatsoever. People were free to leave any time they wanted. The fact that nobody chose to leave wasn't a crime. Bradley's article was never published. His editor thought it sounded like paranoid conspiracy theory. But Bradley kept investigating. He found records of other towns, 17 of them, just like Constance had said. Small, dying communities across the US and Canada where the Ashworths or families with similar names had appeared, invested heavily, and gradually absorbed the entire population. The towns still existed on maps, still had mailing addresses, but something essential about them had changed. They'd become something other than human communities. They'd become nodes in a network, connected by that shared consciousness that Constance had described. Ashmont still exists. You can visit it. The people are friendly. The town is clean. Everything appears normal. But if you stay until evening, you'll hear it. That low humming sound, coming from every building, every home. And you'll see them, all 83 residents, standing in their yards or on their porches, all facing the same direction, all swaying slightly to that internal rhythm. The inheritors, preserving something that should never be preserved, propagating something that should never spread. And every year, a few travelers passing through decide to stay. Just a few. enough to keep the pattern growing, enough to inherit the future, one dying town at a time. Story 5. The Radio Signal of Blackwater Ridge. Blackwater Ridge, Newfoundland, was so remote that most Canadians had never heard of it. Population 68, accessible only by a single road that washed out every spring and froze solid every winter. The people there liked it that way. They were descendants of the original settlers, families that had been there for 200 years, living off fishing, hunting, and a stubborn refusal to join the modern world. In January of 2011, the radio appeared. Nobody knew where it came from or who brought it. It was just there one morning, sitting in the center of the town square, an old-fashioned radio from the 1940s, wooden cabinet and all. Beside it was a handwritten note. "Turn me on, listen carefully." Wilhelm Baxter, the closest thing Blackwater Ridge had to a leader, wanted to throw it away immediately. But his daughter Fiona, a curious 18-year-old who dreamed of leaving Blackwater Ridge for St. John's, convinced him to at least see if it worked. She plugged it in at the community hall, and to everyone's surprise, it powered on immediately, despite being an ancient device that should have required adapters and repairs. Static filled the hall. Then, slowly, a voice emerged. It was describing Blackwater Ridge. The voice listed every resident by name, described their homes, their relationships, their secrets. It knew that Wilhelm had cheated on his taxes for 15 years. It knew that Fiona had been saving money to run away. It knew that Gerald Pickford had accidentally killed his neighbor's dog and buried it in his backyard. It knew everything. The broadcast lasted exactly 1 hour, then returned to static. The residents were terrified and furious. Someone demanded they destroy the radio immediately. But before Wilhelm could smash it with an axe, the radio spoke again. This time the voice was different, softer, almost pleading. "Please don't destroy me. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to warn you. Something is coming to Blackwater Ridge. Something that will end everything here. But if you listen, if you follow my instructions exactly, some of you can survive." Against his better judgment, Wilhelm let the radio continue. Over the next 3 days, the radio broadcast for 1 hour each evening at exactly 6 o'clock. It told them stories, horrible stories about the thing that was coming. It called the thing the Hollow, and described it as a presence that erased places from existence. Not just physically, but from memory, from records, from history itself. The Hollow had already consumed 14 communities across Canada, the radio claimed. Towns that no one remembered anymore, places that had been scrubbed from reality so completely that even photographs of them had become blank. The radio said the Hollow was drawn to isolation, to places that had cut themselves off from the world. Blackwater Ridge was perfect prey. It would arrive on January 28th at precisely 3:02 a.m., and it would consume everything. Buildings, people, memories, unless they followed the radio's instructions. The instructions were bizarre. The radio demanded that everyone in Blackwater Ridge record their voice, saying specific phrases in specific locations. Gerald Pickford had to stand at the north edge of town and recite the alphabet backward. Fiona had to sing "O Canada" at the old cemetery. Everyone had a different task, a different recording to make. The radio provided an old cassette recorder and blank tapes. Some people refused. About 20 residents thought the whole thing was an elaborate hoax and wanted nothing to do with it. But the rest, driven by fear and the radio's specific knowledge of their lives, complied. Over the course of a week, they made their recordings, following the radio's instructions precisely. January 27th arrived. The radio's final broadcast was simple. Play all the recordings simultaneously at 2:55 a.m. tomorrow. Do not stop playing them until dawn. If you do this, the Hollow will find another voice, another pattern, and it will pass over you. If you don't, you will cease to exist. Wilhelm organized a watch. 43 people gathered in the community hall, each with their cassette tape, ready to play them on the hall's collection of old tape players. The 20 who'd refused stayed in their homes, doors locked, thinking the whole town had gone insane. At 2:54 a.m., they started the tapes. 43 voices filled the night, each reciting different phrases, singing different songs, speaking different words. The cacophony was maddening, but they kept playing. And at exactly 3:00 a.m., something changed. The darkness outside the windows became absolute. Not the normal dark of a winter night, but a darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. It pressed against the building, seeping through cracks, crawling under doors. And within that darkness, they heard sounds. Not sounds of anything specific, but the absence of sound taking form. The negative space of reality becoming audible. Those inside the hall kept the tapes playing, even as the darkness tried to force its way inside. Several people screamed. Fiona covered her ears, blood trickling from her nose. The building itself began to groan, as if being squeezed by invisible pressure. Then, slowly, the darkness retreated. The recordings continued, and the darkness moved away from the hall, flowing toward the homes of those who had refused to participate. Wilhelm watched through the window as it engulfed Gerald Pickford's house. The building didn't explode or collapse. It simply ceased to be, along with everything and everyone inside. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving nothing but empty ground, as if a house had never stood there at all. One by one, the homes of the 20 who refused were erased. Not destroyed, erased. And with them went any memory of the specific people who'd lived there. Wilhelm found himself unable to remember the names of some of his own neighbors, people he'd known his entire life. At dawn, the recordings ended. The darkness was gone. Blackwater Ridge remained, but diminished. 43 people survived. 20 ceased to exist in any meaningful way. And the radio was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived. The Survivors. Story 6. The company store of Millbrook Junction. Yukon Millbrook Junction was a mining town that died with the mine in 1963. By 1975, only 47 people remained, most of them elderly, stubborn, refusing to abandon homes they'd lived in for 50 years. The old company store sat at the center of town, boarded up and empty, a massive wooden building that had once sold everything from dynamite to dresses. After the mine closed, there was no reason for it to stay open. Everyone did their shopping in Whitehorse, an hour's drive on good days. In March 1975, someone reopened the store. No one knew who. It just happened. One morning, the boards were gone from the windows, the doors were unlocked, and the interior was fully stocked. Shelves loaded with goods, refrigerators humming, cash register ready. The prices were incredibly low, cheaper than anywhere in Whitehorse, using the old mine script system that had been obsolete for decades. Ellen Balfour was the first to shop there. She needed milk and bread, didn't want to drive to Whitehorse in the snow. She walked into the store, found everything she needed, took it to the counter. A man stood behind the register. He was old, dressed in clothes from the 1940s, with a name tag that read, Griffith. Ellen didn't recognize him, and she knew everyone in Millbrook Junction. He rang up her purchases using the antique cash register, told her the total in mine scrip. Ellen explained she only had Canadian dollars. Griffith smiled, said scrip would do just fine, that everyone in Millbrook Junction had scrip at home, in drawers and boxes, worthless currency from when the mine ran things. Ellen did have scrip at home, her dead husband's pay envelopes, kept for sentimental reasons. She brought them the next day, traded them for groceries. The exchange rate was amazing. What would cost $40 in Whitehorse cost the equivalent of $3 in scrip. Word spread quickly. All 47 residents started shopping at the company store. They dug through attics and basements, finding old scrip, generations of worthless mine currency suddenly valuable again. The store had everything they needed: food, supplies, medicine, even luxury items that hadn't been available in Millbrook Junction for decades. Griffith was always there, always polite, always ready to make change. He never seemed to age, never looked tired, wore the same clothes every day. When people asked where he'd come from, how he'd restocked the store, when he'd be getting new inventory, he'd smile and say the company provided everything its employees needed. The problems started in May. Reverend Tobias Langford noticed that fewer people were attending church. They were tired, they said, needed to rest on Sundays. When he visited their homes, he found them in good spirits, but strangely lethargic. They moved slowly, spoke carefully, as if thinking through every word. Then Iris DeChant mentioned something that made Tobias deeply uneasy. She'd tried to drive to Whitehorse to visit her daughter, and found she couldn't leave Millbrook Junction. Her car worked fine, but every time she reached the edge of town, she felt overwhelmingly compelled to turn back. A physical sensation, she said, like invisible hands pushing her vehicle around. Tobias tested it himself. Same result. He could drive out of town, but his body refused. His hands would turn the wheel, his foot would hit the brake, and he'd find himself driving back toward the company store without consciously deciding to do so. By June, no one had left Millbrook Junction in 6 weeks. The store's inventory never decreased. No matter how much people bought, the shelves stayed full. Griffith continued taking scrip, making change, thanking customers for their patronage. But people were changing, moving slower, speaking less, spending more time at the store, wandering the aisles, touching products, staring at things they didn't need. Tobias searched the town archives, trying to find information about Griffith. He discovered that a man named Samuel Griffith had been the company store manager from 1921 to 1948. He'd died in the store in 1948, heart attack behind the register, still wearing his work clothes. The photograph in the archives showed the same man who was currently running the store. Tobias confronted Griffith, demanded to know what was happening. Griffith smiled that same polite smile and explained in a calm, reasonable voice. The mine had owned everything in Millbrook Junction once. The houses, the land, the store, the people's labor, their time, their lives. When you worked for the mine, you were paid in scrip that could only be spent at the company store. Your money went back to the company. You were never free. You lived and died in debt to the mine. The mine closed, but the debt remained. It always remained. The land remembered. The store remembered. And now that the store was open again, now that people were using scrip again, they belonged to the company once more. Just like before. Forever. Tobias tried to warn the others, but they didn't care. They were content. Food was cheap. The store had everything they needed. Why leave? By August, the residents of Millbrook Junction had stopped speaking entirely. They'd shuffle from their homes to the store, exchange scrip for goods they didn't need, carry their purchases back home, then return for more. A cycle. Shopping, returning, shopping again. Their movements became synchronized. They'd all arrive at the store at the same time, stand in neat lines, wait for Griffith to serve them. Tobias Langford was the last holdout. He refused to shop at the store, refused to use his scrip. He ate canned goods from his basement, rationed his supplies, and watched as his neighbors transformed into something less than human, more like automatons following invisible tracks between the store and their homes. In September, his supplies ran out. He was starving. The store was full of food, and he had scrip, his father's pay envelopes saved for 40 years. What harm could it do? Just once, just to eat. He walked to the store, Griffith greeted him with that same polite smile, asked what he needed, rang up his purchases with the antique register. The exchange felt good, natural, like coming home. Tobias left with a bag of groceries and a strange contentment settling over his thoughts. The store was convenient. The prices were excellent. He'd shop there again tomorrow. A survey crew from Whitehorse found Millbrook, junction abandoned in 1977. All 47 residents were gone. Homes left unlocked, belongings still in place, but no people. The company store stood open, fully stocked, as if waiting for customers. The survey crew documented everything, took photographs, filed reports. None of them entered the store. Something about it felt wrong. The way it looked at them. The way the interior seemed to breathe. Shelves rising and falling slowly. Door hanging open like a mouth. The government officially declared Millbrook Junction a ghost town in 1978. The buildings were left to decay naturally, but the company store never decayed. Travelers on the road to Dawson sometimes report seeing it. Lights on, door open, shelves visible through the windows. Some people stop, curious. Most of them drive away quickly, reporting a feeling of intense dread. But a few go inside. The store has everything they need. The prices are amazingly low. And if they have any old scrip at home, any mine currency from relatives who worked in the north, Griffith would be happy to make change. The company always takes care of its employees. Story 7. The Vanishing Days of Cartwright Lake, Newfoundland. Time worked strangely in Cartwright Lake, though no one noticed until 2001. The town sat on the northern coast, population 312, sustained by fishing and stubbornness. Winters were brutal. Summers were brief. Life moved at its own pace, slower than the mainland, isolated by geography and choice. The first anomaly was reported by Nessa Fagan, the town's postmaster. She received mail on Monday, September 10th, postmarked September 13th, 3 days in the future. She assumed it was a typo. Someone at the sorting facility in St. John's had misread the date stamp, but the mail kept arriving from the future. September 14th, September 20th, October 3rd. All delivered to Cartwright Lake days before the dates on the postmarks. Other people noticed stranger things. Owen Drennan, who ran the general store, realized his calendar was wrong. He'd swear it was Tuesday, but the calendar showed Wednesday. He'd check his watch, confirm it was only noon, but the sun would be setting as if it was evening. Time didn't match up. Hours went missing. Days skipped forward. By October, the entire town was experiencing temporal disruptions. People would go to bed on Monday and wake up on Wednesday, with no memory of Tuesday. Entire days vanished from their lives, leaving gaps in their schedules, appointments missed, food spoiled that should have been fresh. Dr. Alistair Pembroke, the town physician, tried to document the phenomenon. He kept meticulous journals, recording every day in detail. But when he reviewed his entries, he found inconsistencies. Days he clearly remembered living didn't exist in his journal. Days he had no memory of were described in his own handwriting, complete with details he couldn't recall. Then people started seeing their own futures. Maura Hollett was preparing dinner when she saw herself walk past the kitchen window. Her future self, wearing different clothes, looking older, walking with a limp Maura didn't currently have. Maura ran outside, found no one there, but 3 days later she slipped on ice, injured her knee, developed the exact limp she'd seen in her future self. The phenomenon accelerated. People saw themselves everywhere. Tomorrow's version walking down the street. Next week's version shopping at Owen's store. Next month's version attending church. All coexisting in the same moment, all visible simultaneously. Alistair Pembroke theorized that time in Cartwright Lake had become unstable, that past, present, and future were bleeding into each other. He searched for causes, magnetic anomalies, underground deposits, something scientific. What he found was worse than scientific. The town church kept records dating back to 1847. Alistair discovered recurring reports of time anomalies throughout Cartwright Lake's history. Every 50 years, like clockwork, residents would report missing days, future mail, seeing themselves existing in multiple times simultaneously. And every 50 years, people would vanish. The 1847 records mentioned 12 residents who disappeared during a temporal disturbance. They didn't leave town. They simply ceased to exist in the present. One day they were there. The next day they'd been erased. Not dead. Erased. No bodies, no graves, no memory of them except in written records. The same in 1897. 23 people gone, vanished from the present tense. In 1947, 31 residents disappeared. Alistair found photographs of them, read their names in census documents, but no one in Cartwright Lake remembered them. It was as if they'd been extracted from the timeline, leaving only echoes. It was 2001, 54 years since the last vanishing. Close enough that Alistair felt cold fear settling in his stomach. He tried to warn people, told them to leave town, to get out before the pattern completed itself. But most residents didn't believe him. Time was strange, sure, but Cartwright Lake was home. Where would they go? The disappearances started on November 7th. Nessa Fagan was the first. She was sorting mail at the post office, visible through the window. And then she simply wasn't. Owen Drennan, who'd been walking past, swore she didn't leave. She just stopped existing. One moment she was there, the next moment the post office had been empty for hours. Dust on the counters, no sign anyone had worked there recently. Owen checked his memories. He knew Nessa. He'd known her his whole life. But when he tried to remember specific interactions, conversations, shared moments, he found nothing. The memories slid away like water, leaving only knowledge that Nessa Fagan should exist, but didn't anymore. One by one, residents of Cartwright Lake began to vanish. Not dramatically, not with any warning. They'd simply cease to be in the present. Alistair would watch it happen. See someone walking down the street, blink, and find the street had been empty all along. The person would be gone from now, but visible in the past and future. He'd see them yesterday in his memories, see them tomorrow in temporal flashes, but they didn't exist in the present moment anymore. By December, 74 people had vanished from Cartwright Lake's present tense. Alistair documented everything, knowing his records might be the only proof these people had existed. He wrote down names, described faces, recorded every detail he could remember before those memories dissolved. He began seeing a pattern in who vanished. They were people with the deepest roots in Cartwright Lake. Families who'd lived there for generations. People whose ancestors had experienced the previous vanishings. It was as if the town itself was collecting them, pulling them out of normal time, adding them to some other existence. Alistair packed his belongings, prepared to leave. But when he tried to drive out of town, he found he couldn't. The road was gone. Not physically gone, but temporally gone. It existed yesterday. It would exist tomorrow. But right now, in this present moment, there was no road, no way out. He was trapped in a town that was eating its own present, pulling residents out of now and scattering them across when. The last entry in Alistair Pembroke's journal, dated December 21st, 2001, described seeing himself vanish. He wrote that he'd looked in a mirror and watched his reflection fade, becoming transparent, then invisible. He could still feel his body, still think and move, but he no longer existed in a way that could be seen or remembered. He was becoming like the others, extracted from the present, filed away in some other time. Provincial authorities investigated Cartwright Lake in 2002 after mail piled up uncollected. They found the town empty, buildings intact, belongings in place, but no people. The population had simply disappeared. Census records listed 312 residents. The investigators found evidence of only 238. 74 people existed in historical documents, but had no traces in the physical town. No belongings, no photographs, no indication they'd ever lived there. Time in Cartwright Lake continues to behave strangely. Surveyors report their watches running backward, dates on calendars changing randomly. One research team spent what they thought was 3 hours in the town and discovered 8 days had passed. The vanished residents are sometimes visible to visitors. Transparent figures going about daily routines, shopping at stores that have been closed for decades, walking streets that shift between past and present. If you try to interact with them, they don't respond. They're not ghosts. They're still alive, still living their lives, just in a different when than now. And every 50 years, the pattern repeats. The next vanishing is due in 2051. But in Cartwright Lake, where time doesn't follow normal rules, who knows when that will be? Yesterday? Tomorrow? Now? Story 8. The Memory Market of Sunderland, Nova Scotia. Sunderland was an ordinary fishing village of 504 people until Garrett Parrish opened his antique shop in the spring of 2009. The shop appeared overnight, occupying a building that had been empty for years. One day, it was a derelict storefront with broken windows. The next, it was fully stocked with furniture, photographs, jewelry, clothes, all manner of old things carefully arranged and priced. Garrett Parrish himself was an enigma. No one knew where he'd come from. He spoke with an accent that seemed to shift between British, French, and something else entirely. When asked about his inventory, he'd smile and say he acquired things from estates, from people who no longer needed their possessions. The prices were extraordinarily cheap. A beautiful Victorian desk for $20, an antique wedding ring for $5, a rack of vintage clothes priced at $1 each. People began shopping there regularly, finding treasures, decorating their homes with pieces of history. The problems started subtly. Kylie Arsenault bought a mirror for her bedroom, ornate and lovely. The first night she hung it, she had vivid dreams about a woman she'd never met, seeing through that woman's eyes, living that woman's life. The dreams continued every night, growing more intense. Kylie began knowing things she shouldn't know, the layout of houses she'd never visited, the names of people who'd died before she was born, memories that weren't hers. Others reported similar experiences. Bernard Cottrell bought a pocket watch and started remembering a war he'd never fought in. Miranda Eisner bought a set of dishes and found herself cooking recipes she'd never learned, speaking words in a language she'd never studied. They were inheriting memories from the previous owners of these objects. Father Rowan McIsaac noticed the pattern first. Every item in Garrett's shop carried memories, not metaphorically, literally. The objects were soaked in the experiences of their previous owners, and anyone who bought them would absorb those memories slowly, night by night, until the memories became indistinguishable from their own. Rowan confronted Garrett, demanded to know what kind of business he was running. Garrett smiled that strange, shifting smile and explained in his strange, shifting accent. Memories, he said, were the only things that truly mattered. Possessions were just vessels for carrying memories. When someone died, their memories didn't disappear. They soaked into the things they'd touched, the objects they'd loved. Garrett collected those objects, preserved those memories, and sold them to people who needed more life, more experience, more history than their own brief existences could provide. It was a service, he insisted. The dead got to continue existing in the minds of the living. The living got to experience more than one lifetime. Everyone benefited. Rowan demanded people return their purchases, get their money back, rid themselves of these contaminated objects. But most people refused. They liked the memories. They felt richer, fuller, more complete. Why live one life when you could live dozens? By summer, nearly everyone in Sunderland had bought something from Garrett's shop. The town began changing in subtle ways. People used phrases that hadn't been common in decades. They preferred music from before their time. They dressed in styles that had been out of fashion for generations. They were becoming amalgamations of themselves and everyone who'd owned their purchases before them. Rowan watched in horror as his congregation transformed. During services, parishioners would pray in archaic language, sing hymns that hadn't been performed in a century, refer to church events from decades before they were born, as if they'd personally attended. Children who'd bought toys from Garrett's shop played games that hadn't existed in modern times. They'd speak about friends who died in the 1950s, reminisce about schools that had been demolished, cry over losses they'd never personally experienced. The collective memory of the town was expanding backward, consuming the present. Rowan tried to burn his own purchase from the shop, a simple Bible he'd bought for $5. When he put it in the fireplace, it wouldn't burn. The flames avoided it, bending around it, as if fire refused to consume something so saturated with memory. He took the Bible back to Garrett's shop, demanded to return it. Garrett was waiting, still smiling. There were no returns, Garrett explained. Once you accepted a memory, it was yours forever. The Bible Rowan had bought had belonged to 7 previous owners, all reverends, all struggling with faith. Their doubts were now Rowan's doubts. Their questions were now Rowan's questions. Their final moments, their deaths, their fears, all of it was soaked into that Bible, and Rowan had absorbed it all. Rowan fled Sunderland that night, drove to Halifax, tried to start fresh, but he couldn't escape the memories. They haunted him. He'd be walking down streets he'd never visited, and know exactly which houses used to stand there, which families used to live in them, because one of the previous Bible owners had ministered there in 1912. He'd meet strangers and recognize them as descendants of people he'd never met, seeing family resemblances across generations, knowing their histories through memories that weren't his. By September, Rowan McIsaac forgot who he was. The 7 reverends who'd owned the Bible before him had merged with his identity. He couldn't remember his own childhood clearly, but he could remember theirs. He didn't know which fears were originally his, which hopes belonged to someone else. He drove his car off a bridge near Truro. Authorities ruled it suicide. But Rowan's final note, found on the passenger seat, suggested something different. He wrote that he'd become a memorial. He contained multitudes. 7 lives lived through him, and he couldn't bear the weight. But destroying himself wouldn't end those memories. They'd just transfer to the next person who touched his possessions, who inherited what he left behind. Memory was eternal. It never died. It just moved, looking for new hosts, new minds to inhabit. Back in Sunderland, Garrett's shop continues to operate. The inventory never depletes. Every week, new items appear. Clothes, furniture, books, jewelry, all of it pristine, all of it incredibly cheap, all of it soaked in memories waiting to be transferred. The population of Sunderland has remained exactly 504 since 2009. No births recorded, no deaths. The same number of people, year after year. But the individuals change. New faces appear in town, wearing old clothes, speaking with old mannerisms, carrying memories that predate their physical ages by decades. They're not possessed. They're not ghosts. They're just ordinary people who bought things from Garrett Parish and became someone else. Multiple someone elses. a community of individuals who each contain dozens of previous lives, all coexisting in single bodies. The present and past merged so thoroughly that no one can tell where one person ends and their inherited memories begin. Garrett Parrish still runs his shop, still smiling that shifting smile, still selling memories disguised as antiques. His own age never changes. He looks the same in 2025 as he did in 2009. When asked how old he is, he laughs and says he's been collecting memories for a very long time. Long enough to have forgotten which memories are originally his. Long enough to have become a vessel for thousands of lives, none of them entirely his own. The shop accepts new inventory every day. Estates from across Nova Scotia, possessions from the recently dead, objects soaked in memory, ready to be sold, ready to transfer their histories to new owners who'll live those lives again, keeping the dead alive in minds that will eventually forget they were ever separate people at all. If you ever visit Sunderland, you'll notice everyone seems older than they look, wiser, like they've lived more than their years suggest. And if you're offered something from Garrett's shop, if you're tempted by those impossibly low prices, remember this. You're not buying an object. You're buying someone's life. Their memories will become yours. Their experiences will replace yours. And eventually, you won't remember which life you started with, which person you were before you became everyone who'd owned that beautiful mirror, that perfect watch, that simple Bible that carries the weight of 7 lost souls searching for someone to remember them.